The air in the private dining room of the upscale San Francisco restaurant was thick with the scent of jasmine and expensive cologne. Crystal smoothed out her silk dress, feeling a bit out of place despite being Nancy's maid of honor. She had always stayed within her comfort zone, preferring the familiarity of her own community. But Nancy, being half Korean and half white, was the bridge to a world Crystal didn't often cross. "My family from Seoul finally landed," Nancy whispered excitedly, leaning into Crystal. "Wait until you meet them. They're a lot, but I love them." Crystal smiled, though a strange nervousness fluttered in her chest. The bonding dinner was meant to unite the bridesmaids and groomsmen, but it felt more like a royal summit. Suddenly, the heavy oak doors swung open. A man in his late 20s walked in. He wasn't in a tuxedo like the other men. He wore a casual but obscenely expensive black button-down, the sleeves rolled up to reveal a glimpse of ink on his forearms. Behind him, 3 men in sharp black suits stood like shadows. "Min-jun," Nancy shrieked, sprinting toward him. He caught her in a hug, his face softening for a fraction of a second as they spoke rapidly in Korean. When he looked up, his gaze swept the room, dismissive and cold, until it landed on Crystal. His eyes lingered, dark and predatory, boring into hers. Crystal looked away immediately, her heart hammering against her ribs. She felt marked before a single word had been spoken. Throughout the dinner, Crystal could feel Min-jun's eyes on her. She tried to focus on the conversation about flower arrangements and seating charts, but the presence of the man at the end of the table was suffocating. He didn't eat much, he simply watched. "Crystal, you're so quiet," Nancy's fiancé, David, teased. "Min-jun, this is Crystal. She's been Nancy's rock since freshman year." Min-jun didn't nod. He didn't offer a polite smile. He simply tilted his head, his voice a low, gravelly baritone when he finally spoke. "Crystal, an interesting name for someone so guarded." "I'm just taking it all in," Crystal replied, finding her voice. She forced herself to meet his eyes. "It's a big wedding, lots of new faces." "Some faces are harder to forget than others," he said. The table went silent for a heartbeat. The men in suits behind him remained like statues, but Crystal noticed the way they watched the door and the windows. This wasn't just a wealthy businessman. This was a man who lived in the shadow of violence. Nancy laughed, sensing the tension. "Min-jun is a bit intense, cries, it's the family business." Crystal wanted to ask what business required bodyguards at a wedding dinner, but the look Min-jun gave her told her that the answer was something she wasn't ready to hear. 3 nights later, the pre-wedding gala was in full swing. The ballroom was a sea of white orchids and gold leaf. Crystal was exhausted from her duties, slipping out onto a darkened balcony to catch her breath. The cool night air was a relief until the smell of expensive tobacco drifted toward her. Min-jun was leaning against the stone railing, a silver lighter flickering in his hand. He didn't look at her, but she knew she was there. "You're hiding," he stated. "I'm resting," she corrected, stepping up to the railing, keeping a safe distance. "Don't you have people to intimidate inside?" He let out a short, dry laugh. "They are already intimidated, it becomes boring after a while." He turned to face her, the moonlight catching the sharp angles of his jaw. "Why are you so afraid of me, Crystal? Is it because I'm not what you're used to?" Crystal bristled. "I prefer people who don't need a small army to go to dinner. I like peace. I like knowing who I'm talking to." Min-jun stepped closer, invading her personal space. The heat radiating from him was intense. "You think you know yourself," he whispered, his hand reaching out to catch a stray lock of her hair. "But you've lived in a cage of your own making. You're curious about the world outside, my world." The chemistry between them was a physical weight, pulling them together despite the sirens wailing in Crystal's head. She should walk away. She should go back to the safe, brightly lit ballroom. But when his thumb brushed against her lower lip, her breath hitched. "You shouldn't touch me," she breathed, though she didn't move. "I do what I want," Min-jun replied, his voice dropping to a dangerous level. "And right now I want to know if you taste as sweet as you look." He didn't wait for an answer. His mouth crashed onto hers, and it wasn't a gentle introduction. It was a claim. Crystal's mind went blank as she wrapped her arms around his neck, pulled into a vortex of heat and hunger. He broke the kiss, his forehead resting against hers. His eyes were wild, searching. "My hotel," he rasped. "Now." Logic had left the building. Driven by a lifetime of playing it safe and a sudden, desperate need to feel alive, Crystal nodded. She followed him through the side exit, past the men in black suits who bowed as they passed, and into a waiting black sedan. She knew she was crossing a line she could never uncross, but for the first time in 22 years, she didn't care about the consequences. The penthouse suite was a blur of shadows and silk. Min-jun was a man of action, his touch demanding and possessive. As they moved toward the bed, the reality of the moment began to settle on Crystal, but her desire for him outweighed her fear. However, as the clothes fell away and the intimacy deepened, Min-jun's movements suddenly slowed. He felt the hesitation in her body, the specific tension of a woman who had never been here before. He stopped, hovering over her, his dark eyes wide with disbelief. "Crystal," he choked out, his voice thick with a mix of shock and something deeper. You've never." "I haven't," she whispered, her face flushing. "I was waiting for, I don't know, something that felt real." A strange expression crossed Min-jun's face, a mix of primal triumph and a terrifyingly deep sense of responsibility. He was a man who took what he wanted, but this was different. This was a gift he hadn't expected. He finished what they started, but with a newfound intensity that bordered on worship. Afterward, as Crystal slept in the oversized bed, Min-jun stood by the window, watching the city. His life was blood and shadows, but he had just found something pure. And in his world, when you find something pure, you lock it away where no one else can ever find it. Crystal woke up to the sound of silence. The sunlight filtered through the heavy velvet curtains of the penthouse, illuminating the stark, modern furniture. The bed beside her was empty, the sheets cold. For a moment, she felt a pang of regret. Was she just a conquest to a man like Min-jun? She dressed quickly, her hands trembling as she remembered the intensity of the night before. She had given him something she had guarded her whole life, and the weight of that choice was beginning to settle in her chest. She found her phone on the nightstand and saw a notification. The text was from an unknown number, but the tone was unmistakable. "You kept yourself for me, I felt it. From today, no man is allowed to touch you. What is mine is off limits. My driver is downstairs to take you to the wedding venue. Do not make him wait." Crystal stared at the screen, her heart skipping a beat. It wasn't a sweet morning after message. It was a decree. It was a claim of ownership that both terrified her and sent a shiver of heat down her spine. He didn't ask, he commanded. The ride to the wedding venue was silent. The driver, a tall man with a jagged scar across his knuckle, didn't say a word. Crystal looked out the tinted windows of the SUV, feeling like a prisoner in a moving fortress. When she arrived at the church, the chaos of Nancy's wedding took over. Bridesmaids were running around with hairspray, and Nancy was a nervous wreck. "Where were you?" Nancy hissed, pulling Crystal into the dressing room. "I called you 10 times. I got lost in the city," Crystal lied, her face heating up. Nancy narrowed her eyes, then looked closer at Crystal's neck. She reached out and moved a lock of hair, revealing a faint purple mark. "Crystal, please tell me you didn't get involved with Min-jun. He's my cousin, and I love him, but he's not. He's not a date kind of guy." "I can handle myself, Nancy," Crystal said, though she felt the weight of the phone in her pocket. "No one handles Min-jun," Nancy whispered, her voice uncharacteristically grave. "He doesn't have friends, he has subjects, please be careful." During a brief moment of downtime before the ceremony, Crystal's curiosity got the better of her. She remembered a hushed comment she'd heard at dinner about Min-jun's story being famous in certain circles. She opened YouTube and typed in his name. Thousands of results popped up, mostly in Korean, but several English-language, true crime, and global business channels had covered him. She clicked on a video titled The Rise of the Soul Dragon. The narrator's voice was clinical. Min-jun Kang took over the Kang syndicate at 24 after a bloody coup that left 3 rival factions decimated. Known for his absolute ruthlessness and a scorched earth policy, he transformed the organization into a global powerhouse. Rumors suggest his reach extends into the US, though he remains untouched by the law. Crystal watched footage of him walking out of a courthouse, surrounded by the same suits she had seen at dinner. He looked cold, untouchable, and lethal. The man in the video was a monster. The man who had held her last night had been human. She didn't know which one was the truth. The wedding was beautiful, but Crystal felt like she was watching it through a fog. As she stood at the altar beside Nancy, her eyes involuntarily searched the pews. Min-jun was sitting in the front row. He didn't look at the bride or the groom. He looked only at Crystal. He wore a dark charcoal suit that made him look like a king among commoners. Every time Crystal made eye contact, she felt the off-limits warning from his text echoing in her mind. After the I do's, as the guests headed to the reception, Min-jun intercepted Crystal in the stone corridor of the church. He stepped out from behind a pillar, his presence instantly shrinking the hallway. "You look beautiful in blue," he said, his voice low. "You can't just send me texts like that, Min-jun," Crystal said, trying to find her backbone. "I'm not a piece of property." "Property can be replaced," he said, stepping closer until she was pinned between him and the cold stone wall. "You are a rarity. I have never encountered someone like you. That makes you a prize, and I protect my prizes." The reception was held at a private estate in the hills. As Crystal tried to mingle, she noticed something unsettling. Everywhere she went, one of Min-jun's men followed at a discreet distance. If a groomsman tried to ask her to dance, a man in suit would step in the way. If she went to the bar, the space around her was cleared. She was being cordoned off from the rest of the world. She finally cornered Min-jun near the gardens. "Make them stop," she demanded. "I can't even talk to David's friends without your goons scaring them off." Min-jun sipped a dark amber liquid from a crystal glass. "They are not there to scare your friends, Crystal. They are there to ensure that no one forgets who you belong to." "I belong to myself." Min-jun set his glass down on a stone pedestal and took a step toward her, his eyes darkening. "Last night you gave me your innocence. In my world that is a blood contract. You chose to step into my circle. There is no stepping back out." Before she could argue, his phone buzzed. His expression shifted instantly from possessive lover to cold commander. He looked at the screen, then at the perimeter of the garden. "The car is waiting. We are leaving, now." "I'm not leaving my best friend's wedding," Crystal protested, her voice shaking but defiant. "The cake hasn't even been cut yet." Min-jun didn't argue, he didn't raise his voice. He simply grabbed her wrist, not hard enough to bruise but with a firm, iron-like grip that signaled the end of the discussion. "The perimeter has been breached, Crystal. This is no longer about your social calendar. It is about your life." He pulled her through the kitchen exit of the estate, past startled catering staff. Outside, 3 black SUVs were idling, their engines humming like low-frequency growls. The driver from the morning held the door open. "Get in," Min-jun commanded. "Nancy will be looking for me," Crystal cried out as she was ushered into the back seat. Min-jun slid in beside her, the door slamming shut with a heavy, pressurized thud. "Nancy is safe. She is family by blood. You are the target because you are the one I want. My enemies have eyes everywhere and they saw how I looked at you." As the car sped away, Crystal looked back at the disappearing lights of the party, realizing her old life was fading just as fast. They drove for nearly 2 hours, winding through the foggy cliffs of the Pacific Coast Highway until they reached a secluded concrete fortress nestled into the hillside. It was a masterpiece of modern architecture and a high-tech prison. "Where are we?" Crystal asked, stepping out into the cold sea air. "A place that doesn't exist on any map," Min-jun replied. He led her inside, where the walls were lined with monitors displaying various angles of the property. Crystal turned to him, her fear finally boiling over into anger. "You can't just kidnap me. I have a job, a family, a life in the city." Min-jun walked over to a wet bar and poured himself a drink, his movements fluid and calm. "Your life in the city ended the moment you stepped into that hotel suite. My rivals, the Oseung clan, know I found something precious. They will use you to get to me. Here there are 12 armed guards and a reinforced steel gate. You stay here until I say otherwise." The next few days were a blur of luxury and loneliness. The safe house had everything, a gym, a cinema and a chef who prepared world-class meals, but Crystal felt like a bird in a golden cage. Min-jun was rarely there, often disappearing for hours to take whispered phone calls in the war room. One afternoon, Crystal found a laptop and tried to log into her email, but the internet was restricted. The only thing she could access was a local server containing news files and more videos of Min-jun. She found an old news clip from Seoul. It showed a younger, bloodier Min-jun standing over a fallen man. The headline read, "The dragon claims his throne." She realized then that Min-jun's possessiveness wasn't just romantic, it was a survival instinct. In his world, mine meant protected. But the cost of his protection was her freedom. She jumped when she felt a hand on her shoulder. Min-jun was standing behind her looking at the screen. "You are looking for reasons to hate me," he murmured, his breath warm against her ear. "Don't look at the past, look at me." "How can I not look at the past?" Crystal turned in the chair, facing him. "You're a ghost, Min-jun. You show up, claim me like I'm a trophy, and then lock me in a box. I got a text saying I'm off limits. Is that all I am, a territory you conquered?" Min-jun's eyes flashed with a dark fire. He leaned down, placing his hands on the arms of her chair, pinning her in. You are the only thing in my life that isn't stained by blood or business. Yes, you are mine. I felt your heart beat against mine when I took your innocence. That is not a trophy, that is a bond. He reached into his pocket and pulled out her phone, which had been taken from her when they arrived. He set it on the desk. You had 3 missed calls from a man named Marcus, your co-worker. Crystal felt a chill. Yes, he's just a friend. I told him you were moving on, Minjun said coldly. I told him never to call this number again if he values his hands. You did what? Crystal gasped, horrified. I am protecting what is mine, he repeated. Any man who looks at you with desire is an enemy to me. The argument was interrupted by a sharp, rhythmic blaring. The red lights in the hallway began to pulse. Minjun's demeanor changed instantly, the lover vanished and the mafia boss returned. He pulled a handgun from a hidden holster at his lower back. Stay in this room, lock the door, do not open it for anyone but me. Minjun, what's happening? Crystal's heart raced. The Oseung found us, he said, checking the magazine of his weapon. He looked at her one last time, a flicker of raw emotion breaking through his icy mask. If I don't come back in 10 minutes, there is a tunnel behind the bookshelf. Take it and don't stop running until you hit the beach. He vanished into the hallway, the sound of gunfire erupting in the distance. Crystal stood frozen, the reality of her off-limits status hitting her with terrifying force. She wasn't just a prize, she was a target in a war she never asked to join. The walls of the safe house were soundproofed, but they couldn't dampen the vibration of the heavy artillery outside. Crystal huddled behind the mahogany desk, her fingers digging into the plush carpet. Each muffled thud felt like a heartbeat. She thought of California, of her quiet apartment, her morning lattes and her spreadsheets. That life felt like a dream she had had centuries ago. Suddenly, the door to the office exploded inward. Crystal screamed, ducking lower as splinters of wood rained down. A man she didn't recognize, dressed in tactical gear and a balaclava, stepped over the threshold. He wasn't one of Minjun's men. He lacked the silent, stoic grace of the Kang guards. Found her, the man grunted into a radio. Before he could take another step, a single shot rang out from the hallway. The man slumped to the floor. Minjun stepped over the body, his face splattered with a fine mist of blood, his eyes glowing with a terrifying, primal light. He didn't look like a man anymore. He looked like a god of death. I told you to lock the door, he growled, grabbing her hand and pulling her toward the hidden bookshelf. The tunnel was narrow, damp, and smelled of salt spray and old earth. Minjun pushed her ahead of him, his gun raised, checking every corner. Crystal's lungs burned as they navigated the steep descent toward the ocean. They shouldn't have been able to find this place, Minjun hissed, more to himself than to her. Someone betrayed the coordinates. Minjun, you're bleeding, Crystal whispered, noticing a dark stain spreading across the shoulder of his shirt. It doesn't matter, he snapped, then paused, softening his voice just a fraction. Don't look at it, just keep moving. We have a boat waiting at the cove. As they reached the end of the tunnel, the sound of the crashing Pacific grew louder. But as they stepped out onto the jagged rocks of the private beach, the roar of an engine didn't come from a boat. It came from a helicopter hovering overhead, its searchlight blinding them in a white-hot circle of light. Drop the weapon, Kang, a voice boomed over a loudspeaker from the sky. 3 more speedboats emerged from the fog, cutting off their escape by sea. Minjun pulled Crystal behind a large rock formation, shielding her with his body. He was trapped, and for the first time Crystal saw a flicker of something like desperation in his eyes. They want me, Minjun whispered, pressing his forehead against hers. If I surrender, they might let you go. They know you're just a civilian. You think they'll let me go after I've seen their faces? Crystal asked, her voice surprisingly steady. You said I was yours, Minjun, you said I was off limits. If you give up, what happens to me? Minjun looked at her, truly looked at her. He saw the fire in the eyes of the girl he thought was just a prize. He realized then that she wasn't just something to be protected, she was the only reason he had left to fight. He checked his last magazine. Then we don't surrender. Just as the men from the boats began to storm the beach, the sky seemed to ignite. A second set of helicopters, marked with the Kang Syndicate's dragon emblem, roared over the cliffs. Minjun's reinforcements had arrived. The beach turned into a chaotic battlefield of tracers and sand. Minjun didn't stay hidden. He moved with lethal efficiency, clearing a path toward the water where a sleek, black speedboat was now racing toward them. He lifted Crystal into his arms. wadding through the freezing surf as bullets hissed into the water around them. He tossed her onto the deck of the boat where his loyal second-in-command, Han, pulled her to safety. Min-jun climbed aboard, shouting orders in Korean as the boat roared to life, leaping over the waves and leaving the carnage behind. Crystal collapsed onto the deck, soaked and shivering. Min-jun sat beside her, gasping for air, his hand immediately finding hers. He squeezed so hard it hurt, but she didn't pull away. Hours later, they were on a private yacht heading toward international waters. The chaos of the night had settled into a heavy, expectant silence. A medic had patched up Min-jun's shoulder, and Crystal was wrapped in a thick wool blanket. Min-jun stood on the deck, looking out at the dark horizon. Crystal walked up behind him, the salt air stinging her cheeks. "Where are we going?" she asked. "To Korea," he replied without turning around. "California is no longer safe for you. My enemies know your face, my family knows your name." "I can't just move to Korea, Min-jun, my life." He turned, his expression harder than she had ever seen it. "Your life as you knew it is dead. The moment I touched you, I branded you. In my world there is no halfway. You are the woman of the Kang boss." He stepped closer, his hand tilting her chin up. "You kept yourself for 22 years for a man you didn't know. Now you know me. This is the price of being mine." Crystal looked into his dark eyes and realized that he was right. He was a dragon, and she was currently in the center of his horde. The skyline of Seoul was a glittering labyrinth of glass and neon. As the private jet touched down, Crystal felt like she was landing on another planet. A fleet of black luxury sedans sat idling on the tarmac. This wasn't the California she knew. This was the seat of Min-jun's empire. "Stay close to me," Min-jun directed, his voice regaining its kingly authority. He didn't ask, he guided her by the small of her back. They were driven to a massive estate on the outskirts of the city, protected by high stone walls and a small army of guards who bowed in unison as Min-jun passed. Inside, the house was a blend of ancient Korean tradition and cold, modern minimalism. "This is your home now," Min-jun said, leading her to a master suite that overlooked a private koi pond. "My mother and the elders will want to meet you. They will be curious about the woman who broke my focus." Crystal looked at the silk hanbok laid out on the bed for her. "I'm a black girl from California, Min-jun, I don't fit into your dynasty." He stepped behind her, his arms wrapping around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. "You fit where I put you. They will respect you because they fear you." The meeting with Min-jun's mother, Madame Kang, was more terrifying than the shootout on the beach. The older woman sat perfectly still, sipping tea, her eyes scanning Crystal with surgical precision. "She is beautiful," Madame Kang said in Korean, her voice like cracking ice. "But she is a liability. She knows nothing of our ways, she is a target." "She is the woman who kept herself for me," Min-jun replied, his hand resting firmly on Crystal's shoulder. "That makes her sacred. Anyone who treats her as a liability treats me as one." The air in the room turned cold. Crystal didn't need a translator to understand the power struggle. She realized that being off-limits didn't just mean protection from enemies, it meant being shielded from Min-jun's own family. Later that night, Crystal turned to Min-jun in the gardens. "They hate me, don't they?" "They fear what you represent," Min-jun admitted, his gaze softening as he looked at her. "You are my only weakness, but I will turn you into my greatest strength." Over the next month, Crystal's life became a crash course in the underground. Min-jun didn't hide her, he displayed her. He took her to high-stakes meetings and underground galas, always keeping her within arm's reach. He taught her how to read the subtle cues of betrayal and how to command a room without saying a word. One evening, after a particularly tense dinner with a rival boss, Min-jun handed her a small, elegant pistol encrusted with mother-of-pearl. "I told you no man is allowed to touch you," he whispered, standing behind her to steady her aim at a target in the private range. "But if I am not there, you must ensure that remains true." "I never wanted this, Min-jun," she said, her finger hovering over the trigger. "You wanted passion, you wanted something real," he countered, his chest vibrating against her back. "This is the reality of the man you chose, fire and gold. Choose to burn with me, Crystal." She pulled the trigger, the bullseye vanished. She wasn't the girl from the wedding anymore. The Oseung clan made one final, desperate move. They attempted to intercept Crystal during a solo trip to a gallery, a rare moment where she had insisted on a sliver of independence. As two men blocked her path in the corridor, Crystal didn't scream. She didn't freeze. She remembered the weight of the pearl-handled gift in her purse. But before she could reach for it, the men were dropped by silent darts. Minjun stepped out from the shadows of the gallery, his face a mask of cold fury. He hadn't let her go alone at all, he had been the shadow she didn't see. He walked over to the fallen men and looked at them with utter disdain. "I gave the order," Minjun said, his voice echoing in the empty hall. "Anyone who looks at her with intent to harm loses their sight. Anyone who reaches for her loses their life." He turned to Crystal, his eyes searching hers for fear. Instead, he found a fierce, dark understanding. She walked to him, taking his hand. She was no longer a victim of his world, she was the architect of her place within it. A year after Nancy's wedding, a private jet landed back in California for a brief visit. Crystal stepped off the plane, dressed in a tailored black suit, her hair sleek and her gaze unwavering. Beside her, Minjun moved like a king returning to a vassal state. They met Nancy for lunch in a quiet corner of the city. Nancy looked at her friend and gasped, "Crystal, you look different, your eyes." "I'm happy, Nancy," Crystal said, and for the first time she meant it. She had traded the safety of the mundane for the thrill of the extraordinary. That night, back on the jet heading to their next destination, Minjun pulled a velvet box from his pocket. Inside was a diamond the size of a bird's egg, flashing with a dangerous fire. "I told you that you were mine," he said, slipping the ring onto her finger. "But I never told you that I am yours, my empire, my life, my soul. All of it is off limits to everyone but you." Crystal leaned in, kissing the man who had stolen her from one world and given her another. The Mafia boss had found his virgin prize, but in the end, it was the girl from California who had conquered the dragon.